بعدما أشار له المسؤولون العسكريون.
The United States is in a state of confusion and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı. Ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone fixed me on it. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello, and welcome to Varn Blog. And today I'm with Dr. Dwayne Monroe, and we are talking about something that the left may sometimes approach from the standpoint of money when they have to deal with crypto or blockchain, may sometimes approach from the standpoint of cybernetic theory, but in general, doesn't approach or approaches in a naive fashion, and that is the tech industry and its increasing this is one of the few places where I actually think saying ideological gloss is real. I often think we on the left use ideology as like a catch-all for people with ideas we don't like and don't know why they're popular. And then, we make some weird appear to Zizek or whatever. Yeah. But in this area, in the rentier economy of tech, it seems like leftists either don't know how to approach it or they buy the Kool-Aid. So what is the Kool-Aid that we're dealing with the tech industry here? When we talk about the materialist analysis, or you say the physicalist analysis as well, I guess to get out of the whole what do we mean by materialism problem that we get into in left discourse, because that word is used to the point that it's almost non-cognitive for a lot of people. We just
like dialectics, people simply throw it over the fence and presto, voila, I've done something. It's like, well, you haven't done dialectics. I know that.
Yeah,
you thrown a word at me.
Yeah, well, that's dialectics is a fun one, because even when people think they know it, what they seem to turn it into is frankly Taoist folk magic.
Yes, it's true.
It's like contradiction, non-contradiction, sublation. This isn't alchemy, and to understand how Kant and Hegel and thus Marx was using dialectics, you kind of need to know what it originally meant, which is just battling out what a definition is. That's and materialist dialectics instead of doing that in history,
yes,
as opposed to doing it in just a dialogue, as in Plato's dialogues. But all Plato's dialogues are dialectics, and I've been surprised at how many Marxists were like, "What?" And I'm like, "That's basic stuff. If you took philosophy 101, you know this dialect." Yeah. Anyway, or maybe if you were familiar with something other than 19th century German philosophy, because it comes up all over the world. I mean, like, this is also done in, if anyone knows anything about like ancient Indian philosophy, dialectics is huge in that.
There's an ancient work, the Visuddhimagga. I'm probably mispronouncing, of course, the Sanskrit. However, that work,
that's a Buddhist text, right?
It is a Buddhist text, a quite old Buddhist text, actually, and it's basically suffused with a dialectical understanding of thought and of nature. And I believe this document is, it's not long after the death of the Buddha, the historically understood personage of the Buddha. That text was assembled. But you asked the question, what's being missed by people on the left and people in general, and you can imagine a Zizek voice. It's pure ideology, which in this case, I do wish Zizek would say, focus your attention here, because this is such a rich target area. What's being missed is the fact that that the foundation of computation isn't entirely physical. Computers are the result of raw material extraction, labor processes that are being ignored, and that there is no magic at all. And yet it's being presented as if it's magic. And even the supply chains that are involved in the creation of computation, which is at the foundation of course, the use of software, which are just instruction sets which make the lumps of hardware useful. There are people such as Nathan Ensminger and others who are certainly tracking that. But in general left discourse, I've noted a tendency to simply accept that statements made by the industry regarding capabilities can be taken at face value. So that, Zuckerberg shows up and says metaverse, and then 1,000 flowers of debate bloom about the metaverse, but no one says, yeah, but what is the physical material? What is the computational power required to even do this? And can it be done? And if it can't be done, then why are they presenting it as possible? And what will they fall back to when they realize, as I think they realize rather rapidly, that they can't actually build the thing that they touted as being possible? What is actually happening with this narrative? But what we get on the left typically is let's write a very detailed essay about the meaning of the metaverse and how, what will it mean for us when we're all, trapped in VR and so forth. And my argument is always, well, no, this is not going to happen, but something will happen. And in order to understand what is happening, you have to understand the actual machinery that is in use, right? I liken it to the F-35 project, right? I mean, the Pentagon will tell you all sorts of marvelous things about this aircraft, but anybody who actually understands the defense industry and how aircraft work, even at a minor level, or just listen to what experts are saying, says, well, no, there is no super plane. It's a piece of crap. It's a very expensive one, but it's being marketed as a miracle weapon, because there's a political economy around the defense industry. And this is quite similar for tech, in which the actual goals and the actual harms and the actual dangers are being missed when people are pointing towards press releases to guide them towards what they think they should be concerned about.
Do you think that's because the physical infrastructure of technology outside of the laptops that most of us have is actually hidden from view?
That is a big part of it. And I understand that I have a privileged position in this area because I've been in these spaces. When I started my career, there was nothing called a cloud. But when the transition to the so-called cloud occurred, I knew exactly what was going on. There were data centers, servers and racks, storage arrays, all these things that I'd actually built. Like, for example, one of my early efforts was constructing a data center. Well, not myself, participating in the construction of a data center for a major pharmaceutical firm in Philadelphia. This company spent billions upon billions upon billions. The facility's massive because they have the money to spend, of course. And it's no less impressive than what, say, Amazon, Microsoft, or Google are doing with their so-called clouds. I have that in my mind, burned into my mind. And you're right. Most people actually do not. And so there's no one to actually tell them, wait, there's a substrate. There's an actual thing here. With your car breaks down, you know that your car is a machine. Only people who believe in Tesla think that they have a magic carpet. And many of them are just, trying to pump a stock price. But most people know that their car, whether they love it or they hate it, is a machine. But with computation, as you said, aside from your laptop or the thing that you actually are touching, the background, the infrastructure that makes it possible for you to do what we're doing right now, for example, is completely hidden. And although the companies do talk about it, they talk about it to people like me. Like there's documentation and there's presentations and there's complex diagrams and so forth that are inaccessible, that they're not hidden, but they're inaccessible, and it's intimidating if you're not accustomed to the jargon, the language, and what's being said.
So I'm going to give 3 anecdotes that brought me into this world, and it's interesting because it has to do with international travel. Most people of my class background can't do international travel, so this is totally opaque for them. Even people who are from a slightly higher class background than me usually can't do international travel. For the States, it's prohibitively expensive. However, I remember being in Korea and dealing with their tech infrastructure. I mean, Korea is a place where the tech infrastructure is amazing, but like their tech infrastructure, frankly, is better than their plumbing infrastructure. Like it is. I mean, like, and I'm not even being facetious on that. There are places where there's great, internet and Wi-Fi, and there is no plumbing.
I've been to Gwangju, for example, and
exactly,
and like the internet was like, oh my god, this is like Star Trek, but other things were like, well, what's going on?
Exactly. But I remember talking to someone at a university I worked with there about like, well, why can't we do this in America? And the two things that immediately came up: your infrastructure's older because you built it first, and by that I mean like. And I was like, oh, the physical infrastructure is literally older. And then secondly, your country's too damn big.
Yes.
It has to be done by municipal level. You can't do it on a country level like we can, because, we're a country that's the size of a mid-sized state. And and where populations are actually pretty concentrated even. So that was the first lesson. Second lesson was in Mexico, opposite lesson. Why is the internet so shit here? Physical infrastructure, they didn't have the money for it. It got significantly better, and it's highly municipal. Mexico's a highly municipal. Mexico is a fairly big country. And so if you're in a place like Monterey or even Mexico City, you can get good services. But if you're out, in one of the desert mid-sized towns, good luck. So a lot of people rely on cell phone infrastructure, because that's better. And then in Egypt, our internet was probably at the level of like 1992. The physical infrastructure sometimes took months to get turned on to your house. It's completely falling apart. But there's massive tech industry investment in Egypt for a different reason. It wasn't for Egyptians. It was because the massive ocean cable
terminated
that connects Africa, Europe, and Asia actually terminates in the ocean right off Egyptian waters. And so there's all these tech industry people there. In a country that had 20-year out-of-date infrastructure. It was hard to watch YouTube in Egypt in 2015, and it wasn't because
and yet you have this massive cable.
There's this huge cable that comes off and you actually have a lot of tech industry in Cairo, but it's not really for locals. And that got me really thinking about the physicality of the internet. And then I also started thinking about the rent structures of the internet, because like many things, and I told you off air, I realized this when I was actually, this was like 2005. It was one of the many reasons I started giving up on neoclassical political economy, or what we now call bullshit economics. Is that I was looking at things and I was like, this is not profitable without rents. We can infinitely replicate the commodity for very low cost. And everything is based off of government coercion. And weirdly, the only people I saw who ever talked about this, there's a subset of libertarians who everyone thinks is crazy. But they believe in Austrian political economy so hard that they don't believe in rent seeking at all. And
Yes.
so they hate this part of the tech sector.
The open
And then,
source movement people, particularly of the 1990s, when they came out swinging, and their primary target was Microsoft. The people I knew in that world, they very clearly had these sentiments very
yeah.
clearly.
So it was and then the other people were far leftists who started talking about LVT, although they were very rare.
Yes.
I mean, and they weren't really even talking about it in terms of like Microsoft or software. They were talking about it just in general, like monopoly rents. And
Yes.
and then I realized that, and I was like, okay, so we have a physical infrastructure that people don't understand and don't see and
Mhm.
don't think about the logistics of.
Mhm.
And then we have a rent economy that people don't think about.
Mhm.
And they're like, well, why is everything becoming a service? And I guess also because from the standpoint of marketing, it's slightly an easier sell
Yes.
because instead of paying what $120, $200, $300 for Microsoft once for the license
Mhm.
for however number of years,
Mhm.
the price point now, I can buy it at a yearly subscription, or it even comes for free, but I have all these
Yes.
other subscriptions attached to it. And
That's right.
my initial investment shock goes down dramatically.
Exactly. And this also applies to enterprises. I wrote an article for Logic magazine that I guess is due to come out any time now. And the article is about the history of cloud, from the perspective of a person, that being me, who was there in the beginning, who saw the transition from, as I mentioned earlier, building large scale, what we call on premises, that is to say, within our own data center, within a company's own data center, computational estates. In data centers, for those who don't know, are basically just warehouses that house computers, um, and then the transition to everything as a service. And so the question that I sought to answer in that article is, why is this attractive to companies? Um, and the reason is very similar to what you just mentioned about why it would be attractive to an individual. Um, if you're old enough, you remember going into an electronics store and saying, "Oh my God, Microsoft Office is 300, 400. The upgrade price might be 150, but the price if you're coming in fresh might be $400 or $500 depending upon what was bundled in." And then Microsoft says, "Well, look, there's Office 365, and now at a license of $5 per month per person, you can enjoy this software that you can install a version on your computer, and you can also have a cloud version, an online version, and it's always updated. You'll never have to get the next version and update it on your laptop ever again, because we are offering it to you as a service. And with cloud, there's a similar value proposition for companies, which is, rather than doing the capital expenditure of, in the case of major enterprises, millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars every 5 years or so, during refresh cycles, and having also the overhead of having to manage this, to power it, to care and feed for it, to hire expensive engineers, to make sure everything runs, to have expensive contracts with companies like Dell, to come in and oversee and so forth. Now you can say, I can consume the thing that I want: computation, database, storage. I can consume these things now as a utility. Um, and so the advantages are rather clear, but this has a consequence for power dynamics, because now, and I realized this when I think a few years into the so-called cloud era, I began to realize that this is really an interesting power dynamic, because if I was like a pharmaceutical firm with billions at my disposal and had my own data center, yes, Microsoft and back in the day, Sun and others, IBM, they kind of had me by the short hairs, in terms of licensing and so forth. But I have deep enough pockets so that I could hire developers and I could do other things. So I had a large amount of control. Now, however, I'm giving that up, and I'm surrendering the computational, the database, and the storage layer to this company, expanding the rentier relationship in a way that I think many of us haven't really reckoned with. And it's also, I think, reducing the number of people who have direct experience with computation. It's abstracting it in a way that I think has actually political consequences. And it will be turning even people who are in the industry into individuals who don't understand how the infrastructure works.
So I think this leads to a couple of interesting assumptions that have come up from the political economy side of the left, and we can talk about that a little bit. There's been an assumption going all the way back for Hilferding that monopoly rents and monopoly capital could be seized and easily converted into a socialist project. Now, you may know that I have a fascination with cybernetics, but for me, cybernetics is a study of relational feedback loops. It is not actually, I mean, it's related to physical technology. You need physical technology, but CyberSim was built on like 3 shit computers in a developing world country.
Yeah,
like
that's right.
It's not. You don't need a lot.
Yes.
It's more how you structure the information flows and feedbacks.
Yes.
But the way people think this works is, basically a massive supercomputer that outsources all the computational power for you.
Yeah.
And then you could do total world planning with that.
Right.
And I've suspected for a long time that that's not even possible.
It is not. It is my position that not only is that not possible today, excuse me, but it is likely that it may remain impossible for the foreseeable future, and that foreseeable future could stretch into generations. And the reason is because in order to achieve that, you'd have to have genuine artificial intelligence at some level. You'd have to have a computational system that could act, that could reason at some level, right? Because your software will always be brittle. You could have very clever software, and I think that if the principles of cybernetics were better understood by today's crop of software developers, many systems would be much more resilient because they would be planning better for failure. But that knowledge has been lost to a large extent, or people keep reinventing pieces of it and think that they've done something, and they have no idea who Norbert Wiener was, or any of these people. It's not often emphasized in computer science classes. Oh, I lost my train of thought. I don't know why.
See, what were we talking about there? I was asking about why is this particular like dream of the supercomputer that solves all the problems,
fully automated luxury communism,
right?
Why is it a pipe dream? And the reason it's a pipe dream is that it's based upon the idea. And I recently watched a YouTube video from some chap, I forget his name, it doesn't matter, but he presented his vision of fully automated luxury communism. And he just kept saying AI, automation, AI, automation, but without defining these terms. And it was used the way Harry Potter like waves a wand or something. Like I'm just going to make something happen. There's an incantation, automation, or AI, and that produces the good because computation is getting better and better is the assumption. But what we have today, as I've mentioned in other conversations, is pattern matching, and that can assist us in the analysis statistically of data that we gather, kind of a super cybersyn. That certainly is possible, but not I'm going to sit and sip a martini, and the machinery will do the decision making for me. In fact, this is what the tech industry is trying to build, and it's having horrific consequences because proctoring systems that use facial recognition that allegedly determine whether you're cheating or not machine learning platforms that are allegedly determining whether or not prisoners are likely to commit crimes again, benefits determination systems, the list goes on, in which the industry keeps applying this pattern matching technology that they have to decision making flows with horrible consequences for actual people. And so we are seeing an attempt today to build something like that, but for capitalist purposes. If we were to seize it, if we were to seize this like, tomorrow morning, some magic happened and we were in control of this. If we were to continue down this road of trying to make these stat analysis systems do decision making work, we would be continuing to inflict harms on people,
Right.
because they can't do it. Uh, Decision aiding is fine, but not decision making. And the reason that it cannot be accomplished is because we don't know how to build cognitive systems, genuine cognitive systems. As I've mentioned before, we don't understand ourselves, so it's an absurd assertion that we would be able to build another intelligence that could supplement that could be parallel to our own, because we don't even know what intelligence is. In this regard, I follow the work of Melanie Mitchell, who's a computer scientist, who has said many, many, many times that we are, as I said, quoted her in a previous interview, an innumerable number of Nobel Prizes away from even beginning to know what to do. And people push back on her and say, no, 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 this system is thinking like large language models that Google produces, for example, or OpenAI, which the GPT-3 that some people may be familiar with, where a few months ago people were very excited because you would ask a question and it would produce plausible text. And that plausibility, grammatically speaking, was misinterpreted as being intelligence. And it's like, well, no, you can vectorize words and then you can string them together and create something that seems plausible to you, although you probably have to edit it 20 times before you get something that makes sense. This is where we are, and this is where we're likely to be for who knows how long, maybe forever. We really don't know. Even, and I'll say this and I'll be quiet, even in Star Trek, even in a fictional world like Star Trek, if you examine that carefully, what does that world present? It presents a ship's computer that does not think. It has the ability to synthesize text, to examine libraries, and produce output. At no point and now there's exceptions like Mr. Data and so forth, but those exceptions prove the rule, even in this fictional world, because I think they had enough sense in the 1960s into the present day with that line of reasoning, of fictional reasoning, to say that, well, having computers that are doing all this thinking means that there'd be nothing for these characters to do. So the computer has to be limited. And it just so happens that the way that they limit the computer is congruent with probably what the limit of our capabilities would be. If we could produce a computer, or rather a platform that could actually read synthesized text, and then I could say, give me an output on all the work regarding fusion from 1920 to 1933, have a conversation like that and get a good output that was useful to me, that alone would be a major breakthrough. But we can't do that.
It brings me to a couple of things that I have thought about. One, computational power usually requires a certain amount of energy, and when people have started thinking about how to make this more efficient, you start getting into like nano developments to have enough space and computing storage to do this. But people don't understand physics, so they don't know that that's an energy sink. That actually, as you scale down or up, the amount of energy does not scale linearly,
right?
At all. So I've always thought, like, so you want a world that we have the current energy problems that we have with the population that we have, and then a supercomputer that needs to be powered by what exactly to do human computational levels? Like yes. and assuming it doesn't have our biases. That's the first thought. I remember realizing this when I read Nick Bostrom's book from about 11 years ago, Superintelligences.
Yeah.
And I remember going, okay, I see what you're scared about, but you're taking a lot of this on face value because we don't know how fuzzy logic works.
Mm-hmm.
Boolean logic and binary logic do not actually work like the human mind at all.
That's right.
Most models of intelligence I see people playing with are based off of computational linguistics, which means they're only looking at a very small portion of the brain's function.
That's right.
For what people are doing.
Yeah.
So they're not actually trying to replicate all of what the brain does, just what your linguistic and mathematic processing centers do.
Yeah.
We don't really know
what was Deep Blue, for example. Deep Blue,
Mm-hmm.
Deep Blue managed to do a fantastic job of mathematizing chess, and doing chess was considered the pinnacle of human intellectual achievement. But that was the result of a bias. It didn't actually reflect what is in fact, what does in fact make us special, or if to whatever extent we are.
And then I personally, because I'm in education, you mentioned the proctoring software. I am in my day job, I am the department lead of district level online learning support teams, and they're always trying to buy new tech. Most of the tech, frankly, is awful, and I think literally exists to produce jobs off of tax money.
Yes.
But when it doesn't really work. I'm not going to name it because but I used one of these proctoring services and I was like, the kid just looked at a different direction. Okay, now I have to go in, and all the decisions, if I don't, are with plagiarism software. Yes, it's super helpful, but the decision on whether or not this is actually cheating, or the decision on whether or not in this proctored test the kid's actually doing something weird, still has to be made by me. If we make it automatically, and administrators will often try to, we have a bunch of false positives.
Exactly.
Because all it's looking at is a net aggregate. And in the case of the proctoring software, is net aggregate on like a kid's physical movement at a desk. So
because this is what these systems are trapped into. This is their sweet spot. Patterns and statistics. That's their sweet spot. And so whether it's images, whether it's text, whether it's vectorized movement, but that's all they can do. And so that's the hammer. And these companies are turning everything into the nail that can be dealt with via this hammer. But obviously, life is infinitely complex, at least to our mind, infinitely complex. And so I just say it, and it gets people mad. These systems are primitive. I know that the flashing lights and the user interfaces and all of the propaganda around the industry gives us the belief that we're dealing with some hyper advanced thing that comes from the future, but they're all quite provisional, quite janky, quite cobbled together, and quite crude. Once you peel away, the initial layer. I mean, even this thing, right, that everybody celebrates so much. Sure, it's helpful and useful in some ways. It's also a surveillance tool, but most of it was developed, quite some time ago, and it's just sort of cobbled together in a way that we know is far from smooth, just by using it.
Well, this is something that I've told people over and over and over again when they tell me I should be careful with this book because I actually know the author, but I get People's Republic of Walmart arguments, and some of that I agree with, but some of it I'm like, but this tech is a clue designed for consumer preferences and a capitalist economy.
Yes.
Out of some new technology. I mean, the smartphones are but people would be surprised how much of that phone is not new technology, even in the most recent phones.
Exactly.
And I'm always like, so what do you think we're going to do with this? Because it's designed to do certain things, and those are not the things we necessarily want to do in a socialist society, even if we did need the tech development. One of the things that the thing that people don't realize is a lot of our assumptions on technology is based off industrial development. And tech development is similar, but doesn't really work entirely the same way. And either its physical infrastructure or in how important it's, to get all philosophical termy, the teleos of its design is to its function, which is different actually than mechanical engineering, where something generally, the teleos of design matters. So what you design it for really does matter, but it's more generally applicable. This stuff is a lot more specific, but also crude, because it's both, it's specific and crude at the same time, which is for me always very frustrating. I've asked people over and over again, why are you so mad at Facebook? Why has Facebook become so like goddamn impossible to use and everybody gets in trouble? And I'm like, because the algorithm frankly cannot understand irony, and so it over censors.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And in some cases, one of the things that there's an essay out. I forget the author's name, but your AI is a human. So if people Google that, I'm sure that it'll come up for you, which is a fantastic work, because it shows that how the failure mode, I should say, of Facebook, or Meta, I suppose, of their attempt to algorithmically perform moderation. And because it fails, they've had to fall back on people. But they hide the fact that there are people, because they want to give you the impression, and this isn't just true for that company, it's true for many companies. They want to give you the impression that there's this magic glowing cube of knowledge that is performing this work of moderating and analyzing and so forth and so on, when because it's imperfect, to say the least. And as you say, it doesn't understand anything, and certainly irony would be on the list of things it doesn't have any cognition about. They have to use people, but then of course people are overwhelmed, overworked, stressed, and so the whole system is just a giant mess. I mean, Facebook is a fascinating case to me, and one of the reasons I when you started talking about cybernetics, it really sparked something in me, is because I realized that we are literally witnessing these systems fall apart.
Right,
they are falling apart, and
Facebook is in a dysfunctional klug.
Yeah, like, exactly.
It's overcomplicated. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. I was actually like, none of the platform interfaces work the same, and they don't work anymore. Like 15 years ago, it was an objectively a better product than it is now.
When it was simpler and the interface was simpler, and they didn't. And although they always had their ad based ambitions, but they were a bit more targeted, and they hadn't become Augustine in their in their goals.
Right.
But as their goals, and this is true for the entire industry, as their goals become more and more outsized, more and more ridiculous, more and more absurd, they begin to reach the limits of what they can do with this technology. And so they're trying to fill the gap with people, but hiding that fact. I mean, Amazon does this with Mechanical Turk, which is supposed to do this work for you of labeling images. But it's people, underpaid people, doing a lot of this work.
Yeah, a lot of them in North and Central Africa doing it for very, very cheap.
Very, very cheap, yeah.
Some in Southeast Asia and India. But
yeah,
it's I remember Facebook was hiring in Cairo, and I was like, why? But now I know.
Yes.
So it's a very interesting problem. You add into that governments trying to game this.
Yes.
And then these shitty systems also set up shitty reward feedback loops in humans.
Yes.
Why is Twitter a nightmare hellscape? Well, there's a couple of reasons, and one is all the journalists use it because, unlike Facebook, it's not pay to play for spreading information. As a
Mhm.
podcaster, I really noticed this.
Yeah.
I used to do a blog before, and people think that podcast and streaming technology kill blogs. And I'm like, no, Facebook killed blogs.
Interesting.
Facebook's algorithm deprioritized blog shares, and then their advertising platform to get past that was both prohibitively expensive and easily gained by bots. So, literally, I did a literary magazine for 10 years, and not quite 10 years, no, 7 years. And the day that they changed they started doing paid shares and micro ads, organic sharing went down by 70% in a day.
Oh my! Wow.
So while a lot of journalists and people don't really know that happened, they do know that you get more shares organically from Twitter than you do from Facebook.
Yes.
So they use Twitter, but
Yeah.
Twitter, while it is actually, people think it's huge, it's actually the smallest of the of the major
That's
social
right.
media
That's right.
outlets, but it's the one with the most famous people on it.
Yes.
But Twitter, because its algorithm needs people to hate share, actually encourages people to say more and more outlandish things to get their stuff shared.
Yes.
And it leads to the accelerating of what I like to call the rat beef model of everything. So,
right.
Like, even if you're sharing art now, you have to like somehow start a fight with someone so that like people will hate share you, and ratioing will hurt you, but only if it's a real ratio. If it's a half-ass ratio, it actually helps you out. It spreads your message across, and it encouraged it. Like, so a lot of people have studied the way this affects behavior, and you do now have leftists actually looking at that. But they're not looking at why it affects behavior, only that it affects behavior, and that these larger market forces and hidden incentives in the design of the software are really affecting things. I want to get to crypto, though, because crypto is when finally something where people started realizing there was energy sinks in this stuff. Because I remember when crypto started, 10 years ago, and I'm like, I never thought it would last this long, because I'm like, okay, it's basically electric gold, based on a very complicated blockchain software that could be useful for things, but is not in this case. That is hyper deflationary by design.
Yes.
And because it's hyper deflationary by design, actually just sucks energy out of massive mainframe computers. And I realized that like around 2010. I was like, but a lot of people that finally got people to look at the sum of the physical infrastructure and energy cost involved in this. But that's pretty much where they stopped. Like like NFTs and crypto, because I guess it resembles money, and there are at least some leftists who understand political economy, don't think of it in humanities terms like we do everything else. We were like, whoa, okay.
Yes.
There's actual hidden costs to this, hidden in these
and I think it was when some of the miners, for their proof of work efforts, and for those who don't know, that's like adding computational power and solving cryptographic puzzles on a particular chain. You get rewarded with coin, and so it's a way for people to acquire Bitcoin or whatever coin on whatever chain, but Bitcoin, of course, being the largest. And so people setting up these instant data centers like in Kazakhstan and various places, and then getting kicked out because they were, because all of a sudden you can't turn on your light. You have a brownout in your town because of these damn miners. I would say I would like to complexify or add a bit of complexity to even the hope that blockchain is useful, because a computer scientist, David Rosenthal, a couple of weeks ago released a document in which and he did something that I had missed, which was he made a distinction between permission and permissionless blockchains. We're all familiar with permissionless blockchains because that's the whole idea of not having to trust and the cryptographic token being the instrument of security as it passes through the chain. And we know that that's incredibly wasteful and something that needs to be resisted. But Dr. Rosenthal's point was even the other type of blockchain that's less energy wasteful, permission blockchains, is, from his point of view, computationally useless, because what you're really talking about is a distributed database, and we already have those. So his question was, well, what are we even getting with this chain that we're not getting with distributed databases? And his answer is nothing. And that the book isn't worth the candle. That the entire enterprise, even from an architectural point of view, that is to say, a systems architecture point of view, is offensive. And the more I looked into the architecture of blockchain systems, like someone posted on Twitter a while ago, like a Web3 architecture, and it was absolutely ridiculous. I mean, it was just rather than a user interface, logic, software logic, and the server on the back end to serve out everything. It was all these crazy steps to actually get to the website. And I think I said on Twitter that it was, I found it to be technically offensive to me, let alone the moral and other problems with it. And then someone said, well, that's just architectural bullying, which, there you go, someone trying to start a stupid fight. But so I'm willing to throw the bathwater out with this ogre of a baby and say that for the left, such as it is, or leftists, scattered leftists, even the idea that maybe we could use blockchain, I would argue, should just give it up, because those of us who spend a lot of time with this technology have just reached the conclusion that it's useless. Maybe at some point in the future there'll be some different use for it, but the way that it's looking, even the best case, it looks like an absolute train wreck, actually.
So, sitting here thinking about this in the terms of incredibly shifting geopolitical landscape, and I mean, looking that, for example, the only thing that the international internet infrastructure, for example, has decided to stay neutral in these conflicts, but it's one of the only things it has.
Yeah.
There have been leftists who have realized the power dynamics by freaking out about the amount of fiscal transactions that have been targeted with people mostly on the right, although sometimes on the left. I guess there's actually two thoughts that are coming to my mind on this, so I'll finish this one. That these have distributed power to these companies, social power to these companies, by not just how they can shut you out of media sharing or whatever, but they can also shut you out of easy financial transaction. One thing that I know right now, for example, is like there's kind of a crypto binge, and anyone who has to do any kind of international exchange in Russia, because of the heavy sanctions. So that's one thing that I don't think people have thought about it, but they are beginning to. I think people are beginning to see that, although the liberal left and the far left have been totally incoherent on what they think we should do about that.
That's clear, yes. Yeah.
So that's one obvious thing. But there's another thing about this geopolitical stuff that is hinted at what we talked about all the way back in the beginning. And that is, there's a physical infrastructure that is in some cases getting a little old.
Yes.
And we have both geopolitical and climate crises pretty constantly in our future, I think.
Yes.
So how is this going to be maintained?
Exactly. This is exactly what's occurring to me now, and interestingly, at least to me, it was the metaverse conversation that got me thinking more deeply about this because I began thinking, so, what Facebook is actually proposing to do is to build an infrastructure that would rival what Amazon, Microsoft, and Google have done for their cloud platforms. And for those who want like a visual of what that looks like, I suggest you Google AWS global infrastructure. Just Google that, and then you'll see all these data centers dotted.
Yes, that's Amazon's real power, not its shopping power.
Exactly. Data centers dotted, and Microsoft, same story. Google, not so much, but definitely Microsoft and Amazon. These data centers scattered across the globe, consuming power, electrical power, but also gathering political power, or rather socio-technical power, I think I should say. This is an elaborate, a massive infrastructure that I wonder how long this can be maintained. 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 100 years. Whenever I say this on Twitter to techies, they either go silent because they don't want to,
they've never thought about it.
They've never thought about it. And even when they do think about it, like there's a prominent techie who I follow and correspond with from time to time. And he seems like a decent sort of person, but his politics are probably just kind of standard, liberal, West Coast liberal politics, but a decent sort of person, at least parasocially, he seems to be. And when there was an AWS outage a couple of months ago, or a portion of their infrastructure became inaccessible, it was the US East 1 region of their overall global infrastructure. Many companies lost access to their systems. Now, my
school lost access to its system for about 24 hours.
There you go.
Exactly what you're talking about. I know the day it happened.
And that's a long time. That's a long time to not have access to your systems, right? But there are other, no doubt, critical platforms that were not accessible. And so this got this gentleman thinking that, oh, well, is this a failure mode for the cloud? In his mind, for that moment at least, went from hooray cloud to, wow, this is actually a weakness. And so my response was, yeah. And the real question from a complexity and resilience point of view is, how long can we continue to depend upon this? Like, will your children grow up in a world in which this infrastructure exists, or will it be something that people talk about over barrels of fire? Or even if they do have a computational infrastructure, it'll be much reduced, or some different, less sprawling version of this, because I don't think any company, any private enterprise, let alone government, in the history of our species has tried to maintain something like this. I think this is actually quite new. And to get back to what I was mentioning earlier, when you started doing work on cybernetics, and then you pointed me towards the General Intellect Unit, and I started going through their catalog, and then doing the reading, it really sparked something in me, because I'm like, my God, I mean, I've been gathering data about this all this time, and I was familiar with, cybernetics from years past, but all of a sudden it sort of, it sparked something in me that as I said, we're witnessing both the construction and the slow collapse, I think, of a massive complex system, which is our global computational infrastructure, which we have surrendered to private hands, and
which we didn't do with the internet. That's the other thing.
We did not do with the internet, yeah,
but
because the Pentagon understood.
The Pentagon understood it, and then the guy who copyrighted the World Wide Web understood it. Didn't forgo copyright on it, and that's the only reason. Those two legal decisions are the only reason any of this infrastructure, like we know it, was possible. Because it's the Pentagon's decision to keep it open, and like kind of an interesting historical pact made between the companies who developed this and said, okay, we'll respect this, we'll use the Pentagon stuff, and we'll keep it open. That ended with the development of these cloud systems.
That's exactly right.
And people did not know.
Right.
But the other thing, you can kind of think of GIU as like, although I know them personally, and June and Kyle actually have a similar worldview to me about the likeliness of good things in our future, but they're kind of the bright and happy end of what we could do this for. And I actually do think, for example, if you look at cybernetics, it actually solves the iron law of oligarchy problem. But that doesn't mean that it does the decisions for you. It just means that
Right.
you don't need anyone can be a manager now, because the skills hoarding to get the information is now diffused. All right.
Yes.
So that's a good part of it. But when you talk about this current cloud system, I'm going to go off Joseph Tainer on people. I love the rise and or is it the rise and fall of complex civilizations, or the rise and collapse? I can't remember the books. Joseph Tainer's books, because it's based on physics principles. It's and it's applied to civilization. Sometimes it's applied to ecology.
I haven't read, so would he be talking about entropy in some general way?
He's talking about entropy and complex and centralization not leading to simplification and efficiency. It actually tends to just hide complexity.
Interesting.
And social complexity eventually just overwhelms the system. You start having elites and this, that, and the other. Well, I've been looking at this. I've been thinking about this in terms of politics, but I've also been thinking about this in terms of tech infrastructure. Because I'm like, we have an overcomplicated system with too many elites, and both in terms of raw energy to maintain the system, and in terms of administrative management to stay in legal compliance with all these countries.
Yes.
This is not feasible for long periods of time.
Yes. There's a whole field in tech. There's a whole field, site reliability engineering. And, so because these systems are not self-healing, they're not, none of that's automated. You have to have people who know what the hell they're doing, able to intervene, when things go wrong. Right. And that requires a great deal of training, and it requires, consistency over time, because you have to have institutional knowledge. So yeah, my question has become, how long can this be maintained? And then what happens to your political economy? What happens to your society when a lot of your computational infrastructure that you depend upon for a complex society to run has been offloaded to a private entity that is beginning to strain under the load of having to maintain a very complex system that spans the globe? What does that mean? What does that mean when that starts to fail? What does it mean for commerce, for communications, and so forth? And very few of us, I think, are asking this question. It's obvious why people in the industry would not ask this question, because it raises uncomfortable questions, and it also puts in your mind the idea that they are not all powerful and all wise, which is what they want to project.
Yeah, that's what
us.
all managers and all
Yes.
times always want to do.
Exactly.
Because if we realize how useless they were,
Right.
they would just be us if they're lucky.
If you're
we
lucky.
if we don't punish them for their hubris. But getting medieval Greek on people. But the issue that I see here, I've been thinking, because it is often hard, particularly in terms of a podcast, to be like, okay, we're going to take political economy, we're going to take physics and all these fields that are very difficult. I'm a humanist. I am a humanist that can do math, which apparently is rare, and I have a background. I do have scientific training in anthropology, but most people do not seem to be. And I would suggest the reading of a book called Disciplined Minds about why this is a problem. And we can rant about the PMC thesis, and people know my objections to the specifics, but there is a sense in which the complicatedness of what we want people to learn, and the specialization in which we want them to learn it in, is counter developing large systemic, not just theories. I mean, we've seen a history to turn against like theoretical history and history systems, but understanding systems interrelationships at all.
It's a lot to ask, because what most of us listen. I was just saying the other day at dinner with my wife, do you know what I would prefer to be doing? Just drinking this wine and going to a cafe and having some coffee during the day. I would prefer, and I'm sure, and this is what everybody wants, right? You just want to have a life and just not be bothered. because it's a burden to really, in a way. I mean, intellectually, I'm excited, but I'm also terrified of the world that I am growing old into, right? Because it's not a pleasant situation. It is a world of, as you've noted, greater complexity, right? And a multipolar world, but also a world in which the technologies, technological infrastructure begins to, to show signs of strain.
And people haven't realized that I was, and this is where these systems overlapping like will blow people's minds. So I was talking to two people who were trying to fix some problems in modern monetary theory about, well, why can't countries that aren't major powers do it?
Yes.
And then why do all the histories of development of money and modern monetary theory focus on these imperial times or colonial things and skip the medieval period where everyone's on metal? And the answer becomes, well, we use metal not because metal has intrinsic value. That's not why gold bugs are idiots. It is because metal was convertible from a used commodity, from something you could use either as a social status symbol or even practically back into its trade commodity form, because you can melt it and not lose much. All right. Okay, that's pretty obvious. But let me get to where this is going. It was based on not trades within systems, but trades between systems. So token paper money's older than metal money, or at least chip money, or shekel money, depending on how you go. Not paper money so much, but I guess but it's just stores of accounts and debts.
Yeah.
Okay, fine, we got all that. We have figured out a way to get past the metal problem with all of our electrical gadgets. Now we can keep up. We have instant or semi-instant accounting. What happens when that fails?
Exactly.
It's like that throws everything in a wicket. Look at Russia right now.
Yes,
But
right
think now, instead of sanctions, watch these systems. What happens is the Swiss system just runs out of energy.
Yes.
Like, has that ever occurred to you that it could happen? Doesn't seem like it could happen, but it definitely. We know the amount of chaos now that a power outage can do to trade. That in the 70s, frankly, it didn't. I mean, like, it might mess up your freezer, but you could still take money.
Let me give you a story from earlier in my career that illustrates this. So I started my work in information technology at a small boutique bank in Philadelphia. There's a hilarious story about that I won't get into, because the bank was audited by the FDIC, and the owner of the bank, the president and founder of the bank, was doing some pretty funny things. But anyway, one day during audit, I should say that the bank's processing was offloaded to Fiserv in Atlanta, which is
my turf.
Yeah, there you go. So, so Fiserv, for those who don't know, is a company that provides banking processing, among other services. And so the company, this boutique bank, said, well, we're not going to invest in our own, computational infrastructure within on premises, because, well, why should we? We can just do Fiserv. So there were these modems that were called CSUs, DSUs. They were kind of like beefier versions of the 1400, 1900 baud modems that people use in their homes back then. And they maintain connection to Fiserv. And so people would come in, what's my balance? I'm giving you money. I'm taking out money. Green screen terminals, the whole thing. So it just so happens that the FDIC was auditing the bank during a time when the connection to Fiserv was down. And so nobody knew the status of people's accounts. And the auditors noticed this, and that this started a meeting with the board saying, well, this was embarrassing. And it was noted by the auditors that we had no ability to give people access to their stuff, to their money, or give them the status of their money, because our electronic connection to Atlanta went down. And so that started the process of the bank building infrastructure. And this was the beginning of my career, because I was the young idiot who raised his hand and then said, "Oh, I can do this," and built a whole what was called a local area network and servers and all the rest of it, and the rest is history. But it occurs to me that a bank like that today, of course, would build on Amazon or Microsoft, most likely.
Exactly. They wouldn't use their own servers for that.
They wouldn't use their own servers. So the whole thing that I built for this bank that made them resilient, because there would be a Fiserv download like every hour, maybe every half hour, a refresh of data. So because there were other times in which there were outages, but we were resilient against those outages because we had the last known good status of your account, and then there would be a reconciliation once the connection between our on-premises systems and the Atlanta system, once the telecommunications connection was reestablished. Well, as we said, if that bank had decided, as some banks are now deciding, let's just put everything in the cloud, and that cloud begins to deteriorate, there you go, and there's no recourse. There's no fallback. Today, there's resilience because these data centers are redundant and so forth. But as we mentioned a little while ago, as the complexity begins to overwhelm, as power becomes an issue, as there may indeed be climate-related damages to
there already is climate.
Exactly. And what if there's a military strike against a data center, for example, in a contested zone?
I've actually been waiting for cyber warfare to go there. They've been talking about it for a long time, and it hasn't yet. And I'm like, but it might.
Well, Microsoft maintains a very interesting website about security that talks about attacks against Azure, their cloud platform. And this is a very geeky area, but it does contain some rather quite fascinating information, because they talk about literally millions of attacks to try to compromise their infrastructure, and their original security posture was assumed breach, which was somebody has broken in, we have to find them, which I think is a logical approach to it. But there have been instances in which, quite as it's kept, there have been instances in which there have been breaches that don't get big news. But right now these companies have the ability to rally the troops, to, so to speak, to patch these holes and deal with things. But for how long is the question?
I mean, there's a whole lot of other studies here, but one of my favorite, again, we're going all over the place, but this again shows you how these tech systems interface with other systems.
Yes.
I've been working on looking at all the kids who've been sold the, frankly, myth that we have a crisis in STEM. We don't. We actually have an overproduction of STEM graduates. We frankly always have, except for in like two forms of engineering and in coding. Do you know where most of the coding now is going into?
I think they're being seduced into crypto, many of them.
A lot of them are, and that's going to be a waste of time and money. But for what is basically an electronic Ponzi scheme. And people are beginning to see that because of wild fluctuations. But, I went through someone, I was like, okay, crypto was designed to mimic gold. That's what it was designed to do. That's why you mine. Except that it's not a commodity. It has no use value like gold does. Okay, that's not that big a deal. We have plenty of money with no use value. But it's so deflationary, you actually can't even use it nominally. Like you have to peg it to something else to even talk about it, because of the way it fluctuates so quickly and okay, fine. That's its own thing. The other area that I see the most advertising for, because when I was looking, when the pandemic hit, and I was like, maybe it's time to leave education. They were desperately letting people into programs for, and these weird boot camp programs too that are accelerated. Cybersecurity.
Oh yes, indeed.
It's huge.
It is indeed. It is huge. Yes, and age discrimination is a factor in the tech industry, as it is in other industries. And not, the rationale.
It's more in tech than a lot of other industries, though.
Yeah, particularly on the West Coast, which is less said about the West Coast, the better. But but
We don't talk about my plans for California. No.
less said about the valley, the better. But in some areas of tech, it is less of a factor because the need is so great. And the need for expertise is so great that the discriminatory factors are somewhat lessened in that area, and also because organizations tend to need people who actually understand what the enterprise is trying to do, which tends to be people who aren't say 20, to be fair. But yes, that is a huge area because it is indeed the Wild West at this point. And it's a lot. My argument is that cybersecurity is a lost war. The war has been lost. So your enemy, so to speak, has already overrun your terrain, and all you're doing is just trying to put out fires.
I was about to say what it is counter hacking. It's not even really security building.
It's not even security at this point. Exactly.
It's counter hacking. I mean, like I said this because they tried to recruit me, and it tells you how desperate they are because they literally sent me a test to see my basic math skills and if I could look up information. That's all they really cared about. It was one of the tests I've taken in my life. And they didn't care that I was 40, and they didn't care that I had a humanities background. They cared that I could do some basic math.
That's right.
And or maybe a little bit more than basic math, and then look up information. And they're like, we can work with this. And I'm like,
yes, we can train you. We can give you the training for the rest of it. Yeah.
Right. And I'm like, wow, for something this skilled in this specific, they must really need people.
There's desperation. Yes.
If they're like, we can work with, as long as you have a minimal intelligence and you can do basic math, we can get you there. Yeah. And I'm like, wow, because there's no other field right now. Every other field, this credentialization's got insane, and in tech specifically. So what I was always tell kids, I was like, one, if you all learn the code, this won't work, although you probably all should learn the code for you. But when we say STEM, what we really mean is computing.
That's right. Yeah.
Like everything else is kind of a waste of your time. You're going to be just like an English major. In fact, some of the STEM degrees, like biology, I, as an English major, am more likely to be employed. So, like,
I've literally watched this happen on Twitter, in which someone proudly and completely justifiably, because they've worked hard and they finished their education at Stanford or whatever in astrophysics or some other hard science, and they're so proud and they're excited and people are congratulating them. And then but I follow quite a few people in an actual STEM to see just how they're doing and what they talk about. And some of these people get jobs, but many of them not so much. And
or they end up unrelated to things, like
unrelated.
Most of the people I know who got PhDs in astrophysics, and I say most people because I know more than one. They work in either climate change systems now, or they don't do anything related to the highly technical, very specific science. I mean, it's related because it's systems related, but it's not astrophysics. Like,
we no longer have a society. We no longer have a society that that values these things. And to the extent that they were valued, like say in the 1950s or 60s, it was because they were adjacent in some way to the Cold War.
Yeah, Louis Manann's book on this points out that all that scientific stuff was Cold War stuff, and we don't have that anymore. We haven't done a lot of primary research outside of computing for, forever. I mean, like time. If you like, the reason why it seems like physics had stopped is not because we know a whole lot more about physics than we did in the 1970s. It's that A, building things like the CERN are super expensive, and B, no one gives a shit. So
that's right. Exactly. Like, it's just, people, the society as a whole and elites, they don't care because they don't see what the value is of doing these things. And then so you could ask yourself, what's the impact of this on these scientific and engineering endeavors? I mean, for example, people celebrate SpaceX, the fact that, the Falcon booster can land itself. But that's the completion of work that was started in the 1990s under, I believe it was Northrop Grumman. on a program called DCX. I mean, that's essentially what those engineers did, which is not to lessen the accomplishment, but it's to say that it was not a new thing. They simply, completed the work. But when you see SpaceX trying to do something new, which is with the Starship, which is supposed to be even greater than the Saturn V, and that's not working out so well because it requires work in material science and other things that would be quite new. Like if you want to exceed the Saturn V, well, you have to like really be on your A plus plus game, because the people who built that machine were well, good doesn't even cover it, right? I mean that they were the best of the best, and so not to worship what was essentially the work of Werner von Braun, but from an engineering perspective, it certainly was quite an accomplishment, and it's something that we're obviously having a hard time duplicating.
I mean, I think people don't realize the data loss. Like the 50s rockets, we haven't totally been able to create because
Yeah.
a lot of the data is just gone. The technology, the storage technology isn't applicable anymore. But when I tell people that story, I'm like, what? I'm like, yeah, those
That's right.
big old tapes and floppies that they used to use,
That's right.
nothing can read them.
Which is which was predicted. There were scientists and engineers at that time. This was their concern. Of course, no one listened to them, and so like some of these science fiction scenarios of, oh, we have all this, the knowledge of the ancients. The ancients were only a few decades ago, and we can't read their data as if they're hieroglyphs or something. We can just see films of what they built, and go to Huntsville, Alabama, and see what remains of that program. I when what's his name, Branson did his space plane flight, I remember people on Twitter were going bananas, like, "Oh my God, this is a bold new era." And I have a Twitter doctrine that prohibits me from arguing with people, so I try not to mix it up.
Move.
And that's
I
why
should have that doctrine, but I do not.
it's helped me stay sane, and it's also helped me my wife from like hitting me upside the head, because she's like, why are you arguing with these people? But when Branson's space plane, or whatever you want to call it, it's not even a space plane because it didn't really reach orbit. When that plane was launched, I immediately thought of the X-15 program from 1950s. And so people were just going bananas, like this is some bold new technological development. It's like, oh my God, the Air Force did this before I was born, before all of us were, well, many of us anyway, were born. So this is just a redo at a Lilliputian level compared to what the USAF did in 1955 and 1960s with these technologies.
I actually saw that, and I thought about that because I remember learning about that in school in the 80s and going like, hey, I remember this not being that. I mean, it's a big deal, but I remember us being able to do that before we built the shuttle.
Exactly. Exactly.
And the shuttle's been out-of-date technology for most of my life, actually. So
yeah, that's right. It's been out of service. It's still in many ways superior to what's happening now. And to bring it back to computation, one of the things that I try to impart to younger colleagues is that many of the things that you consider to be new, or bold, bold steps forward, like say some programming language or some interface, are not new. It's not as new as you think. Even cloud. I mean, Sun Microsystems produced something called Grid, which someone reminded me of a little while ago, which was a remarkable achievement, actually, in terms of creating like a computational fabric. And this dates back to, my God, the 1970s, 1980s, certainly. There were things that Digital Equipment Corporation was doing. It was just, as I was starting my work in computation, that was just starting to phase out. But what I was exposed to at that time as a young man was quite astounding. And so when people who did not have this exposure, celebrate things that are not as, they're not new. That's really the main point. They are tweaks on technologies that were developed in earlier decades. Yes, the processing power has increased, and storage has increased, and all these things. But there is no discontinuity.
Yeah, unfortunately, the only person I've seen really talk about this is Tyler Cohen, who's kind of a reactionary.
Mm.
But I've been pointing out to people, one, we've been secular decline in technology for a long time, and they go, computing tech, and I'm like, no, even there, you're in secular decline in technology.
Yes,
you just don't know it.
You don't know it exactly.
The tech is hidden from you.
Yes.
But even look at how your programs are working. How many things that used to work have been overdeveloped for, frankly, monetary purposes, or are incorporating, trying to shut out other competitions, that makes the function of the entire program more and more unstable.
Yes.
And then I can tell you, like I said, I work in online education for the state, not in private, which is rare, because most of the online education things are grift, frankly. Yeah. But I can tell you right now that we've had days where, not just because we didn't have enough bandwidth or whatever, we've been having more days with cloud problems because of cloud failures somewhere, not even near us, causing parts of our system to slow down and having to outsource different things. So it doesn't matter what our bandwidth is. The problems with something attacking Amazon services or this and the other. And even though we have some of our systems internal to us, the programs that we outsource to, because we don't develop our own because we can't, do not have those systems internal to us. And this is throughout the system. And I actually pointed out to somebody, I was like, okay, in COVID, I learned two things. One, we have too many administrators, and they're not even with the visible administrators. I'm not talking about site principals. Right? We have all these hidden administrators, and they have such refined niches of responsibility and skill that whenever any outside force comes out, they have to outsource it to a company that has the same problem that they do, and also usually can't do what they're asking them to do. So that I noticed that with administrative technology. I will, when I say technology, I also sometimes mean the way people interact with each other.
The method,
People are like, what do you mean by social technologies? I'm like, that's the way we organize things. I could call it social materialism, social reproduction, but you guys overuse that so much that you wouldn't think about what I meant. Sometimes my strange wording is deliberate, because you're going to have to.
It is a technology, though.
Yeah, it's a tech. It's what it is.
Yeah.
It's a tech that affects the physical world in a way. That's one of the whole things about Marxism that people don't get when they talk about base and superstructure. And they're like, economics is part of the base. And I'm like, most social relationships are part of the base. Social reproduction is literally the foundation, one of the foundation assumptions of Marxism. So, okay, fine. But these social technologies break down. But I also noticed that we've done that with tech too. That we have multiple overlapping systems, so they're not like, even though the district is centralized, there's 5 or 6 hidden things. And unfortunately, a lot of Marxists in particular, but leftists in general, have an early 19th century conception of centralization. And they don't realize that you can hide complexity in a centralized system, and that's all those efficiency gains they think they get, they don't actually get.
I know this from personal experience working with enterprise systems, in which there is the appearance of centralization, or a veneer, or an umbrella. Imagine an umbrella, and then beneath it are millions of ants crawling. Right.
Right. Exactly.
But if you just look at the top of the umbrella, it's like, all is tranquil. This is a lovely umbrella top.
Yep. And I think people need to look at that in the physical infrastructure of tech and in its rent-seeking capacities. Those two things are not directly, they're not the same thing, but they're both part of what's driving this hidden complexity. But for your experience of it, you don't see either of those complex interactions. Well, and massive rents and or the physical infrastructure.
And this is why I started my polemics, was because I realized that I had this knowledge, that my comrades, so to speak, don't have, and it would lead them astray, or they're being led astray. Now, sometimes people are unwilling to listen, and you say to them, "Here's what's actually happening." Like, no, I'm going to continue down the yellow brick road to
The
Oz.
dream of the supercomputer that solves
Yeah,
value theory and makes it
yeah,
where no one has to work. I
yeah,
can't get
exactly.
people to believe that, like, that's not possible. It's literally not possible.
It cannot be done. But the other thing is that I want to help, and I think R.C. Roberts has been helping me sort of sharpen my writing in this area. I want to help people to understand how to think better. So to give you a brief example, uh, there was a conversation I heard in a podcast about Turkish drones. There was a story that came out about Turkish drones in an autonomous fashion hunting and killing a person. And this was sort of stated as if, these Turkish drones were actually thinking and, like in a Terminator fashion, with hunting down an individual and killing them. And that's because the person who was mentioning the Turkish drone, I think the BK2, I believe is the model. I probably have that wrong, but it doesn't matter. They didn't know that, yes, machine learning is probably involved, but it's just a very crude image pattern matching program. And whatever that whatever seemed to match the pattern that was programmed to look for, that's what it fired its ordnance against, which doesn't mean that we've built these Skynet systems. It means that horrible, primitive pattern matching systems are being unleashed on the world, and that will do harm, that are killing people. And we will see more of this, but that's not Black Mirror. Because in Black Mirror, the tech works, but in reality, it kills, but it's not actually working the way that it's being advertised as working. And it's this fine distinction that I'd like to encourage people to begin to understand. Like, when you read these press releases, go, wait a minute. What would it take to actually produce a system that could actually say, oh, well, there's that chap. Let me go kill him. Have we built that? And that's
The
what I
answer
want to
is
encourage people to
no.
have.
It's actually not. What I know that because I was thinking about, like, back in the day, back during the war on terror when I was in my mere 20s. Um, I remember people using the name list for the terror watch list and the no-fly list, and I was like, oh yeah, that's gonna real work, because if you know anything about Muslim culture, and I
Mm,
kind of did. Now now that I really do. I'm like, everybody's got the
mhm.
same damn name.
Right,
So, because
right.
you're named after your dad, and not in all places, like, but you're either named after your father, or you're named after X name and a place, and most of the names are from the Quran. Some are
Hmm.
not, but
Hmm.
there are less names. But and so we're just banning people based off a name convention with a from a culture where we know there's
Yes,
a much higher likelihood of the similar name being used over and over
yes,
again. I can't tell
yes.
you how many Ahmad bin Muhammad's are whatever I've met.
And so then you end up with what is effectively a blanket ban,
Right.
whether that was
Right.
your intention or not.
So now you have drones that shoot people off of similar things based off vague facial
Yes,
recognition. It's about it is
yes,
about as targeted as that no-fly list.
exactly. And this is what I want people to understand, to learn how to read, to read tech information, tech releases better. I mean, I think people are on to Musk. Well, some people aren't, but I think more
Most
people,
people are onto Musk, but
yeah, at this point. But there's other, and there is a tech lash, but it's not directed. It's just, oh, Apple used to be great, now Apple sucks. It's not
Apple was never
deep.
great. There's
They
no
were never great, but now more people know that they're not so great. But it's not deep, and it's that deepening that I think I'm trying to encourage. I'm trying to build within myself, but then also to be kind of an information source for my comrades. To help them to sort through this better, actually, because it's important, and it's important because, as I've said in other places, people are being harmed. First, through the janky decision-making systems that we've talked about. Now, through these military systems that are being unleashed on the world, basically,
crime systems should scare people when we already know. I mean, the one thing I will say is people realize that facial recognition software had racial biases because of the
yes,
number, and people are like, what? It's the biases of the programmers. No, it's not even that. It's the biases of the feeds, like of
yes,
the people you're inputting into it.
exactly.
So you know about that problem, all right? Well, now think about that in terms of guns that shoot you.
Yes,
Like,
precisely. So when someone says, "Oh, we've unleashed, these systems," people immediately go to science fiction, and I certainly enjoy. Well, not so much. I haven't read fiction in a while, but I certainly grew up, and I have no bias against science fiction. Well done, and I enjoy a good space opera as much as anybody else, but I think that the mythology that science fiction is the mythology of Western culture, particularly American culture. Hercules and Achilles, and they're gone, but now we have the
it's sci-fi and comic
dystopic,
books. That's what
it's
we got.
sci-fi comic books, and also the dystopic
Oh yeah, the
sci-fi
dystopic
comic.
YA literature in
Exactly.
particular. Yeah.
Yeah. But the thing, a friend of mine said to me years ago, "Do you know why Star Trek is BS?" And I'm like, "Well, why?" He said, "Because nothing ever breaks on its own. Like whenever there's an episode in which something's wrong with the systems of the ship, there's always some alien intervention." He said, whereas in real life, it would just be, I don't know, Geordie LaForge or someone on board the Enterprise saying, Jesus, the replicator isn't working again, because it just doesn't. It just broke, because that's how machines actually work in real life. Not just, oh well, my iPhone doesn't work anymore because aliens have taken it over or something nonsensical. And it's that sense of how systems fall apart and their shortcomings that I want people to understand, because then when you understand that, when you understand what the actual targets are, then that's where you should direct
Right.
your efforts, what your analytical efforts, your activist efforts, whatever efforts may be, better informed. Basically, the same kind of work that you've been striving to do with Varn Vlog, in trying to help people have better decision making capacity when it comes to looking at political economy and global politics and international relations and various things, because people are walking into these things with naive notions, and which we're seeing unfold now in social media, where people make all sorts of absurd statements about the invasion of Russia, and I mean, sorry, Jesus, the invasion of Ukraine, and rather than either just pausing to observe and then trying to gather information and think better. The same thing in a less lethal way is happening with people's assessments of tech. They're not thinking. They're just saying, "Oh,
Right.
well, I'm just accepting whatever the industry tells me, and that's what I'm going to focus on."
Yeah, that's a good place to end it. I think I could go off about e-learning. I could go off about
Oh my God, yeah.
uh, there's so many areas here that it overlaps with, but I think the one thing that we need to look at, one of the reasons why my show is so diverse and what it covers, is none of these areas are actually discrete, and unfortunately the structure of both our entertainment and we can talk, everyone knows about social media siloing, but also the structure of our education system and its
Mm,
own klug does
mhm,
not encourage anyone to link these things together and start
mm,
seeing them as interrelated, co-evolving mega systems
yes.
that are super complicated. And when you throw in not just good old Marxism or whatever, when you start throwing in, I don't know, a basic understanding of entropy,
Mm,
um, you start having to really rethink some of the primary
mhm,
assumptions that we see right now. And
mhm.
uh, you will probably be back on the show as time permits. I'm also going to be using you as a resource to get other people on. Unfortunately for the world, there's been other stuff that I've had to
Yes,
schedule in
of
really
course.
fast.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
But we will be doing a series on a whole series that on critical thinking about tech and critical, and just like I'm doing a series on political anthropology, because these are areas in which I think, in general, even though people use this every day, this is where there is the least understanding.
I agree. Yeah.
And thank you, Dr. Monroe. You are fashionably Hegelian.
By the way, I do not have my PhD.
Oh, okay.
my initials are Dr. Monroe. I moved to the Netherlands, by the way, with my wife a number of years ago, and in the Netherlands, they always use your first two initials in your last name. So whenever anybody delivers something to the home, they're always like, "Oh, Dr. Monroe," or I talk to the Dutch government about something. "Oh, Dr. Monroe." I'm like, "Listen, I appreciate the honorary degree."
All right, so not Dr. Monroe, Dr. Monroe, Dwayne Monroe, who is fashionably Hegelian. You can find him on Twitter. Your blog is, I will link
it's
it.
monroelab.net. It's very simple.
monroelab.net. And we will be also talking to some scholars that on this area. And I think people do like they know it with crypto, they understand the stuff with the racial bias, because that makes the news, but so much of this stuff is related and it never makes the news and people do not understand it.
That's
right. Partly because the mistakes are actually much broader than something you can simply flame in terms of racial bias or this and other. It's
a big subject, and I mean certainly not in mainstream media do you expect, are you going to go on CNN and have Anderson Cooper say, "And now let me diagram how this works"? No, that's never going.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll be seeing more on this soon. Thank you for coming on the show, and we're gonna chill out with the cool intro.